So great pleasure again to look at the next session, which is an important one. But again, that is the one which is stands between us and lunch. Notwithstanding, we are looking at trying to examine through these four wonderful speakers the maritime strategic developments in our region. So for this, we have four competent speakers. The first one, which is about the salience of Andaman Nicobar. If you recollect, yesterday there were some questions about how important Andaman Nicobar is in the calculations of the new Indo-Pacific free open Indo-Pacific dimensions. Then there are also questions about Quad, which is going to be discussed by Admiral Shekhar Sinha. The first one is, of course, will be discussed by Vice Admiral Chatterjee, who was also the Trial Services Commander, SINCAN, some time ago. I'll read out his bio in a little while. And then, of course, Professor Changappa, who is part of this initiative, who is going to examine issues related to the maritime neighborhood. And last but not the least, we have Mr. Nanda, who is a practicing journalist and who will cover dimensions of maritime diplomacy. With that, let me hand over you to Vice Admiral Chatterjee. Let me briefly introduce you to him. Some of you are already familiar with him and have known him for decades. And just give me a second to open his profile so that I don't miss out on reading out his details about his illustrious career. Yeah, Vice Admiral Pradeep Chatterjee is a submariner. He's commanded two submarines, a frigate, and a guided missile destroyer, and has held many important staff billets over his checkered career over 40 decades. He, of course, came through the National Defence Academy. Then he's passed through the portals of Defence Services Staff College, Wellington, and also the National Defence College in Delhi. At the mid-career level, he headed the Directorate of Submarine Acquisition. The DSO, Directorate of Submarine Operations, as well as Submarine Acquisition at the Indian Naval Headquarters. He has served as Flag Officer Submarines, as well as Flag Officer commanding Maharashtra area, Gujarat area, in the aftermath of 26/11 attack in Mumbai. And on being promoted to the rank of Vice Admiral in 2009, he served as Inspector General at Nuclear Safety, where he steered the Navy's nuclear submarine program. I'm very happy also to acknowledge the presence of Admiral Ganesh, who has been a pioneer in handling nuclear submarines and the related facilities. Admiral also served as Deputy Chief of Naval Staff for 2 years, and he was thereafter elevated to Commander-in-Chief in June 2014, and where he took over the strategically important A&N Nicobar Command, which we are going to discuss today. Over to you, Admiral Chatterjee. Great having you here with us.
Thank you so much. Am I audible and visible? Hello.
You are audible and you are visible. Please go ahead, Admiral.
Okay. Good afternoon to you, and thank you, Chair, for such a generous introduction. And through you, I would like to thank all the organizers of this seminar for inviting me. And without any further ado, I would like to go straight on to the subject. The salience of the Andaman Nicobar Islands, from a security perspective, was understood after decades of benign neglect since the Indian independence. And of course, it was acknowledged on the heels of the Kargil conflict as manifested by the formation of the Andaman Nicobar Command, India's first integrated theater command in 2001. The international focus on Andaman Nicobar Islands grew as the melting pot of the geopolitical developments churned in the 21st century in the Indo-Pacific, namely, or rather, firstly, the US pivot to Asia to counter China's meteoric economic rise and to rein in its endeavors to dominate Asia by its blatant and aggressive, if you may, display of assertiveness in the East and South China Sea, not to talk of the hybrid war it indulges in. Secondly, India's growth and its look-its policy being seen as a regional countervailing force to China. And thirdly, India's departure from its erstwhile non-aligned posture and mending fences with Uncle Sam with a newfound bonhomie. And lastly, the recent optics signaling crystallization of the Quad, accentuated by the global pandemic caused by an irresponsible China inviting its own economic distancing and isolation. In the past decades, the development of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands was stymied by India's overwhelming land-centric strategic focus and inexplicable lack of understanding of the maritime domain by stakeholders of a nation with such a rich maritime heritage like the Cholas, Chalukyas, and the Satavahanas. Capacity building of the Andaman Nicobar Islands in its 19 years of existence languished mired by bureaucratic red tape, glacial speed of decision-making by the concerned ministries, and most disturbingly, inter-service turf war, ostensibly because of budgetary constraints under competing service-specific requirements on the mainland. The development of the island became a victim of not my baby syndrome of individual service headquarters. India's maritime threat perception had largely remained Pak-centric. For decades, we remained oblivious about the dragon's interior motive even after the 1962 Chinese debacle. Constantly, Roland HADR became the focus of ANC, and this was exemplified by the 2004 tsunami and Cyclone Hudud of Isaac 10 years later. ANC continues to conduct a number of coordinated patrols or CORPATs annually with Bangladesh, Indonesia, Myanmar, Thailand, and also a biennial international exercise called Milan with the regional navies. Importantly, a larger role of blue water power projection emanating from the ANC in its area of responsibility remained elusive, hamstrung by its own capabilities and its over-dependence on borrowed assets from the mainland situated 700 nautical miles away. It was the mysterious disappearance of the Malaysian Airlines aircraft MH370 on 8th of March 2014, which came as an eye-opener. Firstly, it exposed the huge gaps and lack of 24/7 air surveillance capability of the Andaman Nicobar, let alone the absence of air defense weapons. Secondly, it brought to fore the keenness of the PLA Navy to carry out search for the lost aircraft in the waters surrounding the Andamans, indicating that they are eager to take advantage of any void created by scant deployment of the Indian naval units in the region. In this particular case, the PLA was restrained by issuing a note verbal to the Chinese embassy in Delhi to keep clear of our waters. China's manufacturing prowess and export-oriented economy in interest in the African continents, its ambitious OBR project, all of these predicates its continued dependence on the sea lines of communication in the IOR, and this was discussed in the previous session too. Protecting its own trade and energy security is a looming vulnerability which will dictate the presence of the PLA in the IOR as long as transit through the Strait of Malacca or any conceived deep-sea port in Thailand in future remains the most economical route. What was once a sparse footprint of the PLA Navy, restricted to its own backyard, has over the past 25 years transformed into an assertive PLA Navy with operations across the entire Indo-Pacific and the globe. China rapidly built aircraft carriers, submarines, warships to sustain blue water operations, preparing itself to challenge the US Navy in South China Sea up to the second island chain for now, and to mitigate its Malacca dilemma should the need arise, and in the long run, prepare to carry out expeditionary roles in the Indo-Pacific. All of this to address its stated objective to be the world's #1 economy by 2049. From 2015, the increase in numbers and frequency of the footprint of the PLA Navy surface units and submarines in the Indian Ocean became even more palpable. The PLA Navy units increasingly displayed their staying power with long voyages from the Chinese mainland across the Indian Ocean and forayed into the Mediterranean and the Caspian. Their research vessels and underwater drones proliferated in the Indian Ocean, collecting electronic intelligence and oceanographic data. This being the background scenario, to nip the PLA Navy in the bud, in a sense, the geographical location of the Andaman Nicobar Islands with an area of 8,000 plus square kilometers, stretching over 740 kilometers, straddling the 10-degree channel and overlooking the 6-degree channel, by itself offers enormous strategic leverage to India. Conversely, a weak Andaman Nicobar Island could become a strategic liability. Much of the public awakening and concern about the Andamans have been accentuated by the current standoff with China in Ladakh. Some feel that the Andamans could be the launch pad to mount operations to thwart our adversary, while others sense a latent vulnerability of the islands from a swift maritime action by China to stretch India's resources in a conflict. I wish to remind the participants that the Andaman Nicobar Island chain contains more than 500 islands, with only 37 which are inhabited. This is how the size of 6 major islands compare with Singapore. Moving north to south, the North Andaman Islands is 1.8 times the size of Singapore. Then comes the Middle Andaman Islands, which is the largest, and this is more than twice the size of Singapore. Further south is the South Andamans, which is also 1.8 times, while the Little Andamans, this is almost the same size of Singapore. Similarly, the Great Nicobar is the southernmost island of the Nicobar chain and is nearly 1.2 times the size of Singapore. Indian Point being its southern tip, which is a mere 90 nautical miles from Indonesia. The entire island chain contributes to 30% of India's exclusive economic zone and has the potential of hydrocarbon reserves as well. But just 22 nautical miles north of the Andaman chain is Myanmar's Coco Island, which has an 8,200 feet runway. Now, the stark reality is that on one hand, China creates artificial islands by bullying other littorals in the Paracel and Spratly group of South China Sea, militarizes them to provide strategic depth to its east coast being the most vibrant economic region. On the other hand, India, which is blessed with strategically placed island chains, is far from exploiting them. To me, these appear to be one of the weakest links of our defense architecture. Recent PLA Navy activities in the Indian Ocean has forced a sense of urgency in matters concerning the Andaman Nicobar Islands. Since 2014, military and administrative reforms and higher resource allocations have yielded substantial results. In 2015-16, the ANC was able to process sanctions of maximum value in infrastructure projects among all the commands of the Indian Armed Forces. Digital connectivity with the mainland and real-time information sharing contributed to operational efficiency. The power projection capability of Andaman and Nicobar Islands has risen with regular deployment of PATI maritime surveillance aircraft from the ANC's air stations and growth in IF's lift capability. With the acquisition of Globemaster and the C-130 Hercules, but their adequate availability during a conflict which will be subject to competing requirements on the mainland. Though air-to-air refueling has increased the radii of action of maritime strike aircraft from the mainland India, yet maritime strike aircraft operations originating from the islands itself has signaled a stronger message. The ANC's capability to be able to turn around a carrier task force, conventional and nuclear submarines signals India's preparedness to counterbalance planned motives. However, unless a minimum number...
Admiral, you have another 5 minutes.
Yeah, can somebody switch off its mic? I think it's disturbing. However, unless a minimum number of maritime and transport aircraft and versatile warships are dedicatedly apportioned to the Andaman Nicobar Command and the infrastructure required to safely house these assets and level 1 and 2 maintenance facilities established, the efficacy of these assets could remain suboptimal in a conflict. On the backing of the comprehensive strategic partnership, future operations of PATI maritime surveillance aircraft from the Australian soil ex the Andaman Nicobar could maximize surveillance efforts in vital areas and optimize resource management. Exchange of intelligence and MDA between the Quad partners, the Quad Plus, and other like-minded nations would go a long way to detect and track the PLA movements. In January 2016, a study group report on comprehensive and sustainable development of the Andaman Nicobar Islands recommended the resumption of projects such as the Kamorta Composite Military Base, an Air Force base in South Bay of the Little Andamans, and another airstrip in the Hud Bay. The Indian Maritime Doctrine of 2009, of course, highlights the need to control choke points and vital trade routes, which are significant for India. And as a corollary, to counter a Chinese attack on India's land borders, India should be able to control the western entrances to the Malacca, Sunda, Lombok, and Umayvata states. Satellite and maritime air surveillance with versatile aircraft could first frustrate planned surface operations and increase vulnerability of Chinese trade in the Indian Ocean. As far as undersea operations are concerned, most of conventional submarines of the plan is likely to restrict its operation in the South China Sea to protect its own backyard, because they are likely to lose the element of surprise should they undertake transits through the Straits of Indonesia, or be left with very little endurance should they plan to circumvent these. Planned assassins with unlimited endurance could operate in the Indian Ocean by avoiding the choke points. However, plan would rather attempt to pre-position its warships and conventional submarines in the Indian Ocean, be it in Gwadar or Djibouti, in the preparatory phase. And this could be a good warning sign that could be obtained with efficient tracking mechanism. Japan has deployed fishhook sensors, and the United States has been working with DRAPES, which is also a seabed sensor for years. India's interest in such ground-based sensor systems could be beneficial. India's recent, if you look at China's recent irrational actions, it has widened the trust deficit between New Delhi and Beijing, and this could make peace fragile in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Indian Ocean region. As India grows in stature on the world stage and stands tall as one of the world's 3 largest economies as predicted, it would be expected to fulfill its obligations and responsibilities towards ensuring a rule-based, inclusive, and free and open Indo-Pacific. Towards this objective, India should have the wherewithal to to exert its influence in the Indian Ocean. This condition cannot be sustained unless its island territories on the eastern and western seaboard are secure and are able to contribute to power projection rather than being liabilities. Strengthening defense infrastructure in Andaman and Nicobar Islands therefore becomes a strategic imperative. For India, it is therefore a Hobson's choice to capitalize on the geostrategic location of Andaman and Nicobar Islands for power projection with higher asset allocation and cooperative engagement. So even as things look up, there are miles and miles to go. Defense infrastructure spending on the islands would also act as a catalyst for private sector spending and would be a key economic driver for overall development of the island chain, which has a huge economic potential. This is why I compared the size of the 6 major islands of Andaman Nicobar Group with the size of Singapore. With the CDS appointed in India and military reforms on the anvil, the onus of positioning requisite assets in the ANC lies squarely on the general. And to bring about greater glory to the Andaman Nicobar in India, and we need this matter be dealt right at the top beyond the Ministry of Defense. Only then matters would move fast and we will reach a state of satisfaction in a decade or so. Thank you. I hope I've restricted myself within the time frame.
Thank you, Admiral, for sticking to time and also for bringing out the importance of Andaman Nicobar in the strategic calculus. Anybody who has a cursory look at our map of the Indian Ocean region will realize how blessed we are in having this forward outpost at thousands of kilometers away, right in the north of Straits of Singapore. And this is where I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for you. Admiral may kindly make note of these questions in the chat box so that you can respond to them subsequently. And without much ado, let me now invite Admiral Shekhar Sinha, an old friend of mine. I know we were together on many occasions, starting our career in Goa. And I know he rose to be the CNC West, and he's a fighter pilot, and he has nearly 3,000 hours of flying. And he has held extremely important portfolios as he grew up in the Navy. So a great pleasure, Shekhar, to invite you for this wonderful session, and look forward to your inputs on the relevance and importance of Quad to what India wants to do in the ocean that's connected from the Indian Ocean. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Vasan sir. A great pleasure speaking under your chair. You have been my directing staff. And thank you, Commodore Uday Rao and Shashi Nair, for inviting me to this very important forum. I heard yesterday's deliberations and this morning, and it has been a very high standard of discussion, very high level of deliberations which have come here. I also like to convey my very fond regards to my former commanding officer on board INS Vikrant, Admiral Ganesh, who was in the audience. I wish to draw the attention first to what made this Indo-Pacific become so important. Not that the concept did not exist earlier, but taking you back to the military strategy paper of 2015 issued by the Chinese government, and I'll quote, and it says, in line with strategic requirement of offshore waters defense and open sea protection, the PLA Navy will gradually shift its focus from offshore waters defense to the combination of offshore waters defense with open sea protection, and build a combined multifunctional and efficient marine combat force structure. The plan will enhance its capabilities for strategic deterrence and counterattack, maritime maneuvers, joint operations at sea, comprehensive defense, and comprehensive support, unquote. So I think this has been the biggest change in the Chinese strategic outlook in the past 10 years or so. And it has a lot of implications, which you can see that it is challenging the international, the world order. We don't know which way the world is headed. While talking about the force development in critical security dimension, the same paper goes on to say, and I quote, "The seas and oceans bear on the enduring peace, lasting stability, and sustainable development of China. The traditional mentality that land outweighs sea must be abandoned." Please notice the words that has been used. And great importance has to be attached to managing the seas, oceans, and protecting maritime rights and interest. It is necessary for China to develop a modern maritime military force and a structure which commensurates with its national security and development interests and safeguards the national sovereignty and the maritime rights and the interest to protect the security of strategic sea lanes of communication and overseas interests and participate in international maritime cooperation so as to provide strategic support for building itself into maritime power. Ladies and gentlemen, what I want to emphasize that it reflects that the military power the naval power will probably precede the traditional commercial traffic to ensure security all along the sea lanes of communication, which has not been so far, because every ship follows the IMO guidelines and you have quite safe the movement of all the trade and commerce. But here is a country which is now talking about these. And mind you, this happened around the time when China had already reclaimed a very large number of land areas, added to the structures and made military bases and put the put airfields and aircraft and also the surface to air missiles. The paper has pegged maritime domain as one of the 4 critical security domains. The other 3 happen to be cyber, space, and nuclear realm. So you can see that what is the priority being given to the maritime force. It says that it will guarantee its vessels safe passage to its commercial ships. And as I said, this is about the time when China was reclaiming all the land structure, etc., etc. It is in this background that the United States pivot to Asia, followed by this Indo-Pacific Command nomenclature has emerged. So, it's quite very, very clear that China is not here just for economics. China is here to increase its influence in the Indian Ocean region, some of it which Admiral Chatterjee mentioned in his talk. Later, you may recall that on 6th of October, there was a quadrilateral ministerial dialogue in Tokyo. Very clearly, it is moving in the direction of a security architecture, and the 4 countries are obviously the US, Australia, Japan, and India. At the end of this conference, Mr. Wang Yi, the Chinese state councillor and the foreign minister, he was visiting the ASEAN countries to see the reaction. And his first stop was at Malaysia. And he said regarding the Quad, I'm quoting him, "Washington is aiming to build Indo-Pacific NATO through the Quad," unquote. He further goes on to say that China no longer describes this, the Quad, as a headline grabbing item. So why it is not important for him? He said that it is foam on the sea, which would soon dissipate. But mind you, when China rubbishes something, it actually reflects its anxiety in that direction, and it will do anything to scuttle the buildup of the Quad character or the Indo-Pacific dialogue, which is going on right now. While Indo-Pacific meant very different things to different countries, it seems to have gained traction now after the four-nation quadrilateral security dialogue in Tokyo, which I mentioned about, and also by the inclusion of Australia in the ongoing Malabar exercise this year. It wasn't surprising at all that Australia was included. The strategic circles and some of practitioners, people like us, the matter was already abuzz that is going to happen anytime. Indo-Pacific actually, what it reflects, not so much of military only. Well, security is also an important aspect, but it generally reflects, as far as India is concerned, interconnectivity of trade, technology, and supply chain in the wider region of Indo-Pacific. Whereas Asia Pacific, which was the predecessor of Indo-Pacific, to my mind, it was more like a trans-Pacific strategic and economic outcome of the World War II. And therefore, Asia Pacific had a lot to do with the continental content of its meaning and was limited, probably by and large, to the East and the Southeast Asia. And it did not have very much traction anywhere else because obviously we were still in a Cold War era, and it was very clearly defined as to which one was in the Soviet bloc and which one was in the American bloc. However, China sees Indo-Pacific strategy as a direct threat to OBOR, the One Belt, One Road initiative, and also sees it as a China's encirclement, by having these countries around it. It is important that there are more countries which encircle China and keep reminding China that what they are doing is not in accordance with the international laws. Only when China finds that all the countries around it are no friends of his and they are all complaining, will China's behavior likely to change? Otherwise, no. In actual, in the reality, I would think that the Indo-Pacific for China is basically an area in which it uses debt trap diplomacy. It uses the fictitious territorial claims, and thereafter divide and rule policy while it deals with the congregation of countries like ASEAN. The direct confrontation between OBOR, BRI, and Indo-Pacific could lead to China making some strategic mistake if it tends to scuttle this whole Indo-Pacific. Coming back to the Quad, the Indo-Pacific, on the 6th October, our External Affairs Minister, he broached the subject of the post-COVID-19 international order. They called for coordinated response to the challenges, including financial problems, which has emanated from this pandemic, and need to share best practices to combat COVID-19 and increasing the resilience of supply chain and enhancing access to affordable vaccines, medicines, and medical equipment. This is quite high on the agenda of Quad right now. They also exchange views on regional issues and matters of mutual interest and issues related to connectivity, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief, maritime safety and security, health security, and counter the terrorism. So it is not, Quad is not all about security and all about military action. There are a lot of, usual maritime things which happen on our day-to-day basis. They also reaffirm their collective vision of maintaining free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. The reaffirmation of their firm support for ASEAN centrality and highlighted their readiness to work towards realizing a common vision for the Indo-Pacific. And they will have more meetings. But what happens is that, I see Quad as the core of the free and open sea Indo-Pacific vision, which needs to be institutionalized. Unfortunately, in spite of this meeting, there was no joint statement. Every foreign minister went back to their countries and they made the statements for their own country. While the three countries, India, Japan, and Australia, were very guarded about making statements and naming China, The US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, he went absolutely openly ballistic by naming China and saying that they need to be resisted. Quad has on its agenda economic prosperity, infrastructure, connectivity, and capacity building. Without these alternatives, countries would continue to be drawn to China, because China is willing and providing these things to these countries, small countries. Excuse me. To say that the Quad and Malabar are same thing would be an error for the time being. While there is a great possibility for the future, this process of linking the two will largely depend on the Chinese behavior in the Indo-Pacific, particularly after the new administration takes over in America. But very unlikely, very unlikely that America is going to be any different, because the would-be Secretary of State, he has already made his remarks, and it looks like that the strategy of America is not going to change. It might slow down a little bit, to my mind, though Fareed Zakaria says that it can slow down quite significantly. But yes, India will be under scrutiny for Jammu Kashmir. It will be under scrutiny for the other parts of irregular things which is perceived by the West, human rights issues. Those things will very much be, but they may not prevent the decisions of the US administration.
Admiral, another 5 minutes. Would
Yeah,
that be okay?
Yeah, I have finished. I'm finishing.
Thank you.
So the while talking about Indo-Pacific and talking about Quad, as you know that Quad has to go beyond Quad, and it has to become Quad plus over a period of time. It has to go beyond the defense domain, and in the present state, present status has been hastened by China. China's aggressive behavior, and its further development will also depend on China's aggressive behavior. And therefore, you may see a pause for the time being. While the naval multilateral exercise Malabar provides for a ready-made security architecture and ready to get linked and institutionalized, Quad will have to go beyond just Quad, as I said, if we have to address the developmental agenda. US has already drawn Brazil, Israel, New Zealand, and South Korea and Vietnam for consultations with Quad for coordinating the response to a pandemic. India is also engaged in trilateral with Japan and Australia for developing resilient supply chain to reduce the reliance on China. You will recall that President Trump has proposed expanding G7 grouping to include Australia, India, Russia, and South Korea. And with change in administration in the US, it is expected that Indo-Pacific Quad Plus initiative would remain on track. China is also waiting for this development to take place so that it can work out its future trajectory. For Delhi, now resources are available, more have to be added. It is for the South Bloc to leverage and display the political will to make difference to the global order which is emerging. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Shekhar. That was a wonderful presentation, a comprehensive one, in trying to understand what it means to India and how we can take this initiative forward to serve our own long-term strategic interests. Not necessarily it's only a counter in getting all the warships together. Like you correctly brought out, there are other dimensions to it which need to be developed. We'll discuss this and a little more in the QA. You may kindly note all the questions which are addressed to you in the chat box so that we save time in reading them out. And I will request Professor Changappa to deliver his talk. I am not going to introduce him because he's already been introduced yesterday when he was sharing a session. So please go ahead and make a presentation on maritime neighborhood. How the maritime neighborhood is evolving in terms of the strategic needs of India, what more can be done, etc. Over to you, Professor Changappa. As usual, I'll again caution you at 15 minutes so that you have another 3 to 4 minutes to wind up. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, is my slide uploaded? Is my PPT uploaded?
Yes, so just a minute.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for this platform to make this presentation on India's maritime neighborhood. Now, India's maritime neighborhood centers around the Indian Ocean, which links the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It is a body of water which passes through Africa, Asia, Australia, and Antarctica. The Indian Ocean gained importance in November 1994 when the United Nations Convention Laws of the Seas came into effect, and nation states started to identify their interests with freedom of navigation and oceanic resources. From an Indo-centric security perspective, the absence of strategic competition and the emergence of China as an alternate security provider made New Delhi review its foreign policy priorities. For instance, India acknowledged the emergence of island diplomacy for the first time, which is evident from the fact that the Ministry of External Affairs in its reorganization incorporated two new divisions, namely the Indian Ocean region and the Indo-Pacific Ocean divisions. This was mentioned yesterday. Today, interestingly, the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval is in Colombo for a trilateral meeting with Maldives and Sri Lanka. So that is island diplomacy in action. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, as you can make out from this slide, there's an immediate neighborhood and an extended neighborhood. One school of thought is that the Indian Ocean is the primary area of interest for India, and the South China Sea is a secondary area of interest. What are the problems in the immediate neighborhood? As mentioned yesterday, you have the Indo-Pak fishing wars and you have the Indo-Sri Lankan fishing wars. On occasion, there have been Chinese trawlers, Thai trawlers, and Taiwanese trawlers in Indian waters fishing illegally. So this is about India's immediate neighborhood. Yeah. Again, this becomes very topical because yesterday's newspapers had a small item that a Sri Lankan fishing trawler or fishing boat was apprehended by the Indian Coast Guard off the Thoothukudi coastline with drugs originating from Pakistan. So these are day-to-day problems of India's immediate maritime neighborhood. The extended maritime neighborhood, which stretches right up to the South China Sea, has a lot to do with Indian trade and commerce, as one of the earlier speakers mentioned, because a lot of trade and commerce goes through. 2 days ago, there was a newspaper report saying that any escalation in the South China Sea will result in 12% GDP loss for the trading economies of the region, what is earlier referred to the Asia Pacific region. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, the countries of consequence in the Indian Ocean, in India's maritime neighborhood. Now, interactions between these countries include major Asian powers, Western countries or Western industrial democracies, and small nations and island states. Now, here France figures among these countries of consequence simply because there's an India-France maritime relationship which enables the Indian Navy to get access to Djibouti and Duqm in Oman and other naval bases, and increases India's military or naval reach into the extended neighborhood. So these countries of consequence, the relations between them, the hostility or cordiality in relations between these countries shape the regional strategic environment or the maritime neighborhood. Next slide, please. Now, we are discussing the regional strategic environment. India's maritime neighborhood is synonymous with its regional strategic environment. an interplay of military, political, economic, and social forces over two different geographies, namely South Asia and Southeast Asia, shape the regional strategic environment. For instance, the last point on the slide here is that the Indian Ocean has now become a theater of great power rivalry, which is symbolized by the race for naval bases. In 2017, the Indian Navy or India got access to the Changi Naval Base in Singapore. Indian warships always visited Singapore, no doubt. But this is immediate access. Earlier, there had to be a lot of government to government and political clearance before the IN warships visited Singapore, but now it is open access. So this is how the regional strategic environment or India's maritime neighborhood is taking shape. Next slide, please. Small island developing states. Now the domestic politics in these island states determines their political proximity or distance between India and China. These island states ideally like to avoid choosing between India, China, or the United States in this competition for great power rivalry. However, India and China and the United States compete for power and influence in these island states through humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations. While it is regionally and known that the Indian Navy was the first to reach Sri Lanka during the tsunami, the US Navy got much more publicity, and the world believed the US Navy reached first. And India and China both compete for power and influence in these small island developing states through investments, especially infrastructure related investments. So, next slide, please. Now, the post-Cold War period, as everybody knows, begins from the early 1990s. Now, one of the many developments is that the coastal state of Somalia became a fragile state and politically unstable one. As a result, a lot of IUU fishing, as was mentioned yesterday, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing took place, and the Somali fishermen were deprived of their livelihood, and as a result started attacking all these fishing trawlers and later merchant ships. Gradually, they realized it was a very lucrative industry and started taking seamen as hostages for ransom. This resulted in the coalition task forces coming into the area, the Gulf of Aden and all that, as everyone knows. And around the same time, you had the US-led operations against Afghanistan and Iraq, enduring freedom of Iraqi freedom. As a result, about 200 plus warships of European Union naval forces, the NATO forces, and independent countries like India, Russia, South Korea, Japan, and China also entered. At the same time, in 2008, as everyone knows in this audience, the Chinese PLA Navy entered the Indian Ocean and has become a semi-permanent fixture in the Indian Ocean. Now, I've made a very provocative statement here saying that the Indian Navy becomes an instrument of national security and foreign policy. All the naval people in this audience may contest that, but I specifically brought it up because apart from 1971, the Indian Navy was never used in war, except in 1965 when there was a little bit of shore bombardment from the Pakistan Navy in Dwarka, that the Indian Navy came into the forefront. Otherwise, the Indian Navy as an instrument of foreign policy assumes more and more importance only from 2000 onwards.
Professor Changappa, you have another 5 minutes.
Sure. Yeah, next slide, please. China's strategic interest in the Indian Ocean is similar to that of the United States. Both powers want to ensure there's energy security and seaborne transportation of cargo for trade and commerce. However, the clash of interests arises as both powers pursue global domination because of their ideological differences. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now, there's a lot of talk about collective security initiative. The ASEAN member states, over which we had a talk just a little while ago, feel that the Quad or the quadrilateral security dialogue is too confrontational against China. The other school of thought is that the Quad weakens the centrality of the ASEAN, and therefore a reconfiguration of the Quad with Quad plus ASEAN. ASEAN with the weight of the Quad behind it would stave off Chinese expansionism more effectively. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. Indo-Pacific is basically an attempt to reconceptualize geography, as a speaker mentioned yesterday. And it's a new political geographic maritime construct. The rationale being a single strategic construct links the Western Pacific to the Indian Ocean. And the drivers for the Indo-Pacific are globalization, trade dependence, seamless maritime connectivity, need to ensure seas for unhindered transportation of trade and energy. However, Russia and China are against the Quad. Today, the Quad is a very geopolitically contested zone. Next slide, please. Now, these islands, basically, we had a former naval admiral speak about the Andaman and Nicobar Command. These islands basically enhance India's aero-naval reach into the Southeast Asian region, and therefore proves a geographic asset to promote Indian military security interests vis-a-vis China. In 1994, the Indian Coast Guard apprehended a couple of Chinese trawlers flying Myanmarese flags, trying to snoop on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, especially near the naval base. And this explains the militarization of the Quad, where in 2001, of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and in 2001, the Tri-Services Command came into being. Next slide, please. Perhaps China could produce a 700-year-old document that Chinese Admiral Chang Ha had visited the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and therefore stake its claim to ownership. And please remember, the Chinese PLA has a Marine Corps. A Marine Corps like the US Marine Corps means it's an expeditionary force. They've got aggressive intentions. Next slide, please. Maritime policies. These are just a representational sample of the maritime policies. And basically, I just want to say that all these maritime policies aim to enhance the multimodal connectivity across land and sea to promote trade and commerce. Next slide, please. Yeah, while everybody has heard of the string of pearls theory, very few people seem to have heard of the necklace of diamonds, which has to do with mantra that former Foreign Secretary Lalit Mansingh articulated in US universities and think tanks sometime in 2012. Like India can use the Indian Navy uses the Natrang base in Vietnam, and Japan can use the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And India-Taiwan political relations proves very relevant because Taiwan is a good listening post into China for India to gain political and military intelligence on China. For instance, a Japanese maritime reconnaissance aircraft can easily pick up Chinese submarines in the Indian Ocean and share it with the Indian establishment. Next slide. Yeah. Today, India, China, and the US compete for power and influence in the region through a race for military naval bases. The danger of too many warships sailing in the Indian Ocean could lead to naval clashes or friction is a strong possibility. War is inherently lurking in the international political system, and India's maritime neighborhood could prove vulnerable to such realities. Thank you. Thank you, I'm done.
Thank you, Professor Shankappa. You kept to time, and that gives us a little more time for the question answer session. And with this, without wasting any more time, may I invite Mr. Prakash Nanda, who is the editor of Geopolitics, to come and share his views on maritime diplomacy. All this that we are talking about is worthless unless it is strongly supported by maritime diplomacy initiatives. So he's going to discuss this. I'm not going to have a detailed introduction about him. I'm sure most of you are aware of his work, and he also brings out this geopolitics journal. So over to you, Mr. Prakash Nanda, and you can cut down time as you consider appropriate. Well, I don't see him here. Maybe we can, while he's perhaps sorting out his technical issues, uh, I will throw open the question answer session. First to Admiral Chatterjee, you may kindly look at the chat box. It will not be read out, and you may combine all the questions and respond together. Thank you.
Okay. Well, can I be seen? Yeah. Well, I've got a couple of questions. One, of course, from Commodore Venugopal, then from Mr. Dhanesh Sakyan, and then somebody asked about the Cocos Islands or the Kneeling Islands. It's the same. So, as far as maritime strike from Andaman and Nicobar, yes, it is being practiced, but I don't know the current position, but you must always remember that if we are carrying out maritime strike from place A or place B, that place needs to be well defended. The assets which are going to carry out maritime strike need to be well protected with blast pens, etc. So otherwise, as a peacetime exercise, it's a different issue altogether. But if we have all these components put together, certainly it would be a worthwhile thing. And as such, the Air Force does practice this from the islands. The other point is, would Rafale and other, modern aircraft be a game changer? I think he talked about Romeo chopper. So the question is that, yes, if you have a better aircraft with longer standoff ranges, etc., definitely there would be a game changer. But there are a lot of things which need to be kept in mind. Firstly, the numbers of Rafale and their competing requirements on the mainland. Next is that, you just can't get a Rafale and tell him to start carrying out a maritime strike, because maritime strike is a different ball game, because pilot orientation at night, etc., is another thing. And so it needs a lot of practice. So unless you have large number of assets, you cannot do that. Lastly, with longer standoff ranges comes another issue about better identification requirements, because you stand to waste, or rather, even at the cost of fratricide, if you don't have proper identification process, if you want to carry out attacks with a very improved aircraft with long-range weapons at a standoff distance. So I think these are the only questions I had. If there are any, I'll attempt them later on.
Thank you, Admiral. Now I'll hand over to Admiral Shekhar Sinha for taking on the questions that are addressed to him. And if there's anything left out, we will handle them later, depending on the time availability. Over to you, Shekhar.
Thank you very much, sir. I have three questions. I'll attend to these in reverse order. First is by Rishi. Would you say that constabulary and benign roles of the Navy are more important than a military role? The answer is no, because benign roles have that is the peacetime role, which is one of the Navy's important roles in shaping the maritime environment around the country. If you say that the country is friendly, I am supporting and I am the net security provider. For that, you have to display something in peacetime, not only in wartime. So in peacetime, this becomes very important. All benign and constabulary roles are the peacetime roles of the Navy. And they are as important as the wartime, because you need to have friends, you need to have people who trust you, people who can depend on you when there is a calamity, when there's a natural disaster, when there is something else. So I would say that no, there's not even the roles of These two roles are two different roles, and both are important for a navy. Second question was by Venu. Venu, you have asked that do we have the political will and resources to join the initiative when it is formalized? I would say, if you asked me this question about 6-7 years back, I would have said no. But I think that the fact that we have reached here, and whenever you have expected something to happen in your gut, it has happened visibly by the foreign minister and the external affairs minister and the prime minister making the right pitch. The fact that, we have come to a level, we have already invited Australia for Malabar exercise. We already have the quadrilateral sort of foreign ministers meeting. So I think there is a will, there is a political will. Yeah, when it comes to do we have resources? Well, the short answer is that, for next 6-7 years, I would think that the present rate of induction should do. But of course, we got a large number of admirals here, and Commodore Wasani has been researching on this. Uday Rao knows better. But my sense is that it is very unlikely that any adversary is going to get a lead in the Indian Ocean, even if they have bases here, even if they have friends here, which he doesn't have, except for creating these problems. I would suspect that the chances of them at any point in time becoming they can sort of encourage, they can influence your neighbors, which you will have to tackle separately. As you know that somebody said that Mr. Doval is in Sri Lanka today for a trilateral talk. So I think there is a political will is being displayed very rapidly. And wherever you are short of assets, that is why you have this collaborative multilateral organization called Quad and maybe Malabar. So we already have a force structure. You see, in maritime domain, it's very difficult for one country to sort of take care of all the security issues. Not even US can do this. Not even China can do this, in a very large country. Third one was India's stance on Taiwan. Can Japan, South Korea be roped in with Taiwan to, maintain peace and stability in the region without the US involvement in political affairs? Well, India's stance is very clear on Taiwan, that we have one China policy. We have a trade relation which is permitted by the government and PRC. So that is what the status is right now. India hasn't spoken officially about anything about Taiwan in the near past. So I would think that it will depend on how the future unravels. Both in terms of China and the US. I mean, the two superpowers who are clamoring for maintaining supremacy, other one for gaining supremacy. So I think that the second thing is that it will be quite difficult to have any sort of political agreements amongst the countries, South China Sea or anywhere in the world, without the presence of US, for a simple reason. As you know, that economically and militarily, US at number one, China is at number two. And let me tell you that China, somebody was saying yesterday that economically more than 4 countries below it in the economic sort of levels. And similarly, it is 4 to 5 times more powerful and stronger than the next 4 or 5 countries. So I think, that will be quite, I would see it as a difficulty that these 3 countries, on their own can manage the security architecture. So I would think that, that may not be a possibility. Thank you, sir. I have finished.
Thank you. I think those measured responses by both admirals, tells us very clearly as to the degree of clarity that there is in both the military establishment as well as the political establishment. Before I hand over to Professor Chengappa, I just wanted to respond to the question posed by the Director General, TECC, who is located in Chennai. That's Director General Chen. I must tell him that having been to Taiwan on 3 occasions, there's a phenomenal amount of cooperation that is there right now between think tanks, between the military establishment, between the political establishment. We may not say too much in public, but the point is that there is a lot of cooperation and collaboration amongst our efforts. To the specific question on how Taiwan can also contribute to our efforts in the Indian Ocean region, that was his point. there are plenty of possibilities. I'm sure we'll be exploring them in the coming years. Due to time constraints, I'll not be able to get into a discussion on those, but I'll request Professor Chengappa now to take over and answer the questions that are posed to him. Thank you.
Yeah. Are you reading out the question? Sorry.
Yes, Professor. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The first question is by Danesh Sankyayan, and his question is, why is Russia against Quad? China is a blockade for Chennai, Vladivostok route. If China is countered, then it would be a win-win for Russia and India. Another question has just come in, sir. Just a minute. Another question posed to you, sir. Ganesh Tangarajesh, regarding the militarization of Andaman and Nicobar Islands, do you think it is enough to protect our national security, or do we need more militarization and securitization? Yes, sir, I think that's it, sir.
Yeah. Okay. The first question of why Russia is against the concept of the Indo-Pacific is they are worried that the balance of power will go the US's way. As far as the level of militarization of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, I would invite my good friend Commodore Uday Rao. We had a little discussion on this. He feels the level of militarization is inadequate, but I feel, there's no end to that. I hope I've made some quick response to the question.
Thank you, Professor Chengappa. In any case, we are running short of time. I just want to know if Mr. Nanda is here.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry because of this technical glitch. There is this thing. I'm extremely sorry for it. And I myself am not very tech savvy, and I am at home. So in that sense, we are talking of maritime diplomacy when two important maritime diplomatic activities are taking place today in our region. But when one talks of this maritime diplomacy, then I must point out that these terms like maritime diplomacy, defense diplomacy, the military diplomacy, they were not in currency till the late 1990s. I think they were, or rather they started to be increased more frequently after the end of the Cold War. And in this context, let me share with you, ladies and gentlemen, is this, that when I was a student and I was studying this international relations or diplomacy in my university, there was one so-called written by a British diplomat called Harold Nicholson. And what exactly he had defined diplomacy as? He had talked about diplomacy being the management of international relations by negotiations through a method by which these relations are adjusted and managed. And this is very important, adjusted and managed by ambassadors and envoys. In other words, diplomacy is the business of a professional and career diplomat. But as you now see, this thing has now changed. Now diplomacy is not the monopoly of diplomatists or the career diplomats. If diplomacy is an art, then there are now many artists. Apart from diplomats, now we have security personnel, businessmen, technocrats, and so on. So Indian diplomacy that way is no longer the preserve of the foreign minister. Indian defense minister these days travel a lot to the foreign countries. In fact, when late Manohar Parrikar was the defense minister, he had visited more foreign countries than late Sushma Swaraj, who was the then foreign minister. Now let me come to the maritime dimension of diplomacy. And like diplomacy, maritime component is also a combination of military, economic, and political elements that permit a nation to exploit or use the sea for its benefits and to deny it to those who are inimical to its policies. In fact, the maritime dimension is closely connected with the phenomenon of globalization, which over a long period of time has evolved or is still evolving to create a more interconnected world by overcoming the limitations of traditional boundaries of the countries. And in this, oceans have played the most important role. In fact, the maritime world can also be seen as a primary source in recent parlance of rather the root cause of globalization, because it is the medium by which 90% of the world trade, when measured by weight as well as volume, is transported. Without the method of oceanic trade, the barriers of global commerce would be insurmountable, and the history of the world would have been vastly different. E-commerce and internet may be the symbols of the most modern version of globalization, but historically, the symbols have been the ever-increasing size and speed of the ships and the shrinking cost of the commercial transport. It is important to remember. Am I being audible, sir?
I know you are breaking off, but you can take another. Yeah, you are audible,
Okay.
but you are breaking off. Please take another 3 minutes and wind up, please.
So my point is that it is important to remember when Alfred described the ocean to be the global commons, but then historically seen oceans as global commons have been used the most by those nations to the benefit of those who had access and resources. As globalization has really benefited the developed countries more than the developing countries. Similarly, when one talks of the global common of the sea, then obviously those who had a powerful navy and other powerful mercantile navy, they really exploited this common thing of the ocean. So viewed thus, I will define Indian maritime diplomacy as the pursuit, promotion, preservation and protection of India's maritime interests. And here, as Professor Chengappa before me talked about, that in 1990s the Navy was declared to be an instrument of Indian and foreign policy, and I think he's 100% right, because here the Navy always plays the most important role in promotion of one's maritime diplomacy. As British scholar Ken Booth in his seminal work Navies and the Foreign Policy says, governments of naval powers have frequently employed their warships in diplomatic or political mode, hoping to affect the thinking and behavior of other governments with little or no intention or expectation of using brute force. By diplomatic in this context is meant the use of warships in support of a country's general bargaining position, particularly negotiating stances and influencing building tactics. In fact, this is something our former president Pranab Mukherjee, the late President Pranab Mukherjee, who was our, as the foreign minister, everybody, Professor Chengappa talked about that became a controversial thing when Navy was declared the instrument of foreign policy. But in India, it was Pranab Mukherjee as the foreign minister way back in 2007. I think he was speaking at the Navy Foundation in Kolkata in June 2007, and he did mention this linkage between maritime affairs, international relations, and the role of the Indian Navy. And I'm cutting short because of the time constraint. And the most important paragraph of that particular speech I'm quoting, he said that that within the larger maritime canvas, it is our nation's military maritime power as embodied by the Indian Navy, supported by the Indian Coast Guard, that is enabling the instrument, that is the enabling instrument that allows all other components of maritime power to be exercised. It is these enabling functions that provide centrality to the Indian Navy within the country's overall maritime strategy and allow it to act as a versatile and effective instruments of our foreign policy. We all know, and I think Admiral Sinha also did point out, our Navy does have a maritime strategy, and they had, I think, initially in 2004, Then they updated it in 2007, and latest update was, I think, sometime in 2015. And in between 2009, they had that maritime, doctrine. That 2004 it was, revised in 2009. So I'm not going into their details, but what are the common, points that all these things put together they make? First, that our major sea lanes of the world are crucially important for India, particularly those that ensure the free flow of oil and commerce from the Gulf. And in any case, our GDP from the maritime trade constitutes is constituted by 43%, and as much as 77% of India's share by value and 90% by volume is carried by sea. Secondly, maritime dimension is also
Mr. Nanda,
vital
could you
for.
kindly conclude? Could you kindly
Yeah,
conclude?
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
No, sorry, I will have to just take another 2 minutes because we have another session starting with
energy
lunch break.
security. There is energy security, and then there is your diaspora factor, and then you have this blue economy, that resources under sea. So all these things are there. So what exactly now we do now, under how exactly our this maritime diplomacy has been manifested. So obviously, in my opinion, I'm cutting it very short, it is a mixed bag. We have now made ourselves present in this Asian Pacific countries. We have military relations with many of them, but whether this is good enough to counter this Chinese increasing Chinese presence and the pressure, I think there will be definitely 2 or 3 different sets of opinion, and the main problem lies there. We promise much, but in our delivery aspect, I think there are many things that remain wanting. And particularly Navy has to play a much more important role, much more vigorous role. It has to be present more prominently, because many people think our presence in Asia Pacific, in most of the places, if you take away Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea, is symbolic. Not that much, I'm not talking of this evacuation and this natural calamities and helping them, because, and why it is so, because our Navy, we need more submarines, we need more carriers at our disposal, and then our decision making structure still needs to be amplified as far as the MOD and the other ministries are concerned. So, but only good thing that has happened, I will conclude by saying that now at least we have got some clarity as far as maritime diplomatic vision is concerned, and there are no challenges. How we meet them, that really is something we all must work towards. The government should work towards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nanda. My sincere apologies for rushing you through. It's just that this session we started with a 30 minutes disadvantage, and unfortunately at the time inverse there you had a technical difficulty. But however, notwithstanding this, if there's any question for you, I'll allow one question to be taken up by you, but I do not see anything in the chat box, so it's possible that there are no questions at this moment.
Yeah.
But if you are free to join us in the if in case you are able to join us during the panel discussion, I am sure some questions may be addressed to you. So at the outset, I think all I would like to do now is to place on record on behalf of all the organizers our gratitude to all the panelists in the previous 2 sessions. There have been some wonderful exposure to the theme that we had selected, and all of them have done full justice, and grateful and indebted to all the speakers for the time that they have taken, and also for responding to all the questions which are there in a very measured way. So that makes it very clear that we have a bright future ahead in terms of our maritime potential capability. So with this, there's not much of gap between this session and the next. The next session is starting at 14:25. There will be no change to that. So roughly about 10 minutes of break which you can enjoy. But the next session will start on schedule by Mr. Shashi. Thank you for this opportunity to meet a lot of old naval friends and other friends, who I am so happy to see in this panel. Thank you. Jai Hind.